Detroit, 1971. The Motown recording studio on West Grand Boulevard was not designed for confrontation. It was built for hits, for assembly line perfection, for songs that made white America comfortable with black voices. But on this particular afternoon, the air inside Studio A carried a different kind of tension. James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, had arrived unannounced, and Marvin Gaye was in the middle of recording vocals for What's Going On. Marvin didn't stop singing when Brown walked in. He was in the booth, headphones on, eyes closed, layering harmonies over the track that would become his masterpiece. His voice floated, androgynous and aching, reaching into registers that most male singers avoided. High, vulnerable, almost fragile. The kind of voice that made listeners lean in, that demanded intimacy rather than commanding attention. Brown stood in the control room, arms crossed, watching through the glass. He didn't sit. He never sat when he was making a point. The engineers knew who he was, knew his reputation, and they said nothing. They just let him stand there, watching Marvin work until Marvin finally opened his eyes and saw him. The recording stopped. Marvin removed his headphones and stepped out of the booth. He was smiling, the way he always smiled when he was nervous or uncertain. A smile that said he knew something was coming, but didn't know what. "James," Marvin said, "nobody told me you were coming by." Brown didn't return the smile. He looked at Marvin for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't hostile, but wasn't friendly either. Then he said it, 5 words that hung in the studio like smoke. "Marvin, you sing like a woman." The engineers froze. One of them actually reached for the talkback button, then thought better of it. This wasn't their conversation. This was something else. Marvin's smile didn't fade, but it changed. It became something more complicated. He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was thinking, when he was deciding whether to engage or retreat. For a moment, it seemed like he might laugh it off, might deflect with charm the way he usually did when confronted. But he didn't. "And you dance like one," Marvin said quietly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric. Brown's expression didn't change immediately. He just stared at Marvin, processing. Then slowly, something shifted in his face. Not anger, not offense, something closer to recognition. And then James Brown laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. The kind that came from surprise rather than politeness. He pointed at Marvin, shook his head, and laughed again. "All right," Brown said. "All right, brother, I see you." What happened in that studio wasn't a fight, it was a negotiation. 2 men, 2 completely different philosophies about what soul music should sound like, what a black male voice should represent, testing each other to see who would back down first. And neither of them did. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what each man represented in 1971. James Brown was the embodiment of masculine soul. His voice was raw, guttural, forceful. When he screamed, it wasn't vulnerability, it was power. When he danced, every move was precision, control, dominance. He was the hardest working man in show business, a self-made king who had clawed his way out of poverty through discipline and relentless performance. Brown's entire career was built on the idea that soul music should be undeniable, that it should grab you by the throat and refuse to let go. Marvin Gaye was the opposite. His voice was soft where Brown's was hard, intimate where Brown's was commanding. Marvin sang like he was whispering secrets, like every song was a confession meant only for the person listening. He wasn't trying to dominate a room. He was trying to make you feel something you didn't know you were capable of feeling. And in 1971, with What's Going On, he was pushing that intimacy into political territory, singing about war and suffering and systemic failure with the same tenderness he used to sing about love. Brown's comment wasn't meant as an insult, not exactly. It was an observation rooted in his own understanding of what masculinity in music should look like. In Brown's world, a man's voice should be unmistakably male, deep, authoritative, a voice that left no doubt about who was in control. Marvin's high tenor, his willingness to sound vulnerable, even fragile, didn't fit that template. To Brown, it was a choice that undermined what soul music was supposed to be about. But Marvin's response, "You dance like one," was equally precise. Brown's dancing, the spins, The splits, the cape routine, all of it was theatrical in ways that traditional masculinity didn't always accommodate. It was flamboyant, performative, expressive in ways that went beyond simple machismo. Marvin wasn't calling Brown feminine. He was pointing out the hypocrisy of the criticism. If Brown could express himself through movement that defied conventional masculine constraints, why couldn't Marvin do the same with his voice? What made the exchange powerful wasn't that it ended in conflict. It was that it ended in mutual respect. Brown recognized that Marvin wasn't backing down, wasn't apologizing for his artistic choices, and that recognition mattered. In a world where Black artists were constantly being told how to perform, how to present themselves, how to make their music palatable, here were two men refusing to conform, even to each other's standards. After the laughter, they talked. Not about the comment, not about the response, but about music. Brown asked what Marvin was working on, and Marvin played him a rough mix of What's Going On. Brown listened in silence, arms still crossed, his face unreadable. When the song ended, he didn't say it was good. He didn't offer praise. He just nodded. "That's not my kind of record," Brown said, "but it's yours. You need to finish it." It was the closest thing to approval Marvin was going to get, and it was enough. The engineers in the room that day later described what happened next. Brown didn't leave immediately. He sat down, something he rarely did during studio visits, and started talking about performance, about how the stage was a battlefield, how every show was a war you had to win. Marvin listened, not agreeing, but not arguing either. He understood that Brown's philosophy came from survival, from growing up in poverty so extreme that dominance wasn't a choice. It was necessity. "When I'm on that stage," Brown said, "I'm not just singing, I'm proving something, every night, to everyone who said I wouldn't make it." Marvin nodded slowly. "I get that," he said, "but I'm not trying to prove anything anymore. I'm trying to say something." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Brown performed to conquer. Marvin performed to communicate. Both approaches were born from the same source, the need to be heard in a world that didn't want to listen, but they manifested in completely opposite ways. Brown asked Marvin about his process, how he approached vocals, why he chose those high registers. Marvin explained that he wasn't thinking about gender when he sang. He was thinking about emotion, about finding the exact tone that matched what he was feeling. Sometimes that meant singing low and controlled. Sometimes it meant reaching into a falsetto that made him sound almost otherworldly. It wasn't calculated. It was instinctive. "You ever worry people won't take you seriously?" Brown asked. "Singing like that?" Marvin considered the question. "Every day," he said. "But then I remember that the people who matter, the ones really listening, they don't care how high or low I sing. They care if it's true." Brown didn't respond immediately. He just sat there processing. For a man who had built his entire career on control, on leaving nothing to chance, Marvin's willingness to be vulnerable in his art was foreign, but it was also, in its own way, courageous. One of the engineers, a young kid who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke up. "Mr. Brown," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Brown turned to him. "Go ahead." "When you do the cape routine," the engineer said, "when you fall to your knees and they drape the cape over you and you throw it off and keep singing, what are you feeling in that moment?" Brown smiled, not his performance smile, but something more genuine. "Resurrection," he said. "Every time. I die and I come back. That's the show." Marvin understood then. Brown's theatricality, his dramatic gestures, they weren't about femininity or masculinity. They were about transformation, about showing the audience that you could be knocked down and still rise. It was survival as spectacle. "That's what I'm doing too," Marvin said quietly, "just in a different way. When I sing high like that, vulnerable like that, I'm showing people you don't have to pretend to be stronger than you are. You can be hurt and still be whole." Brown looked at him for a long moment. "Two different churches," he said finally. "Same God." It was the most profound thing either of them said that day. What happened after that meeting shaped how both men thought about their work. Brown continued making records that asserted dominance, Funk anthems like Get Up, I Feel Like Being A, Sex Machine and Superbad, songs that demanded movement, that turned the body into an instrument of power. He never softened his approach, never made his voice more vulnerable. That wasn't who he was, and he had no interest in pretending otherwise. Marvin, meanwhile, leaned even further into the intimacy that Brown had questioned. What's Going On became not just an album, but a statement, a refusal to perform masculinity the way the industry expected. When he sang Mercy, Mercy Me, when he asked what's going on, with that aching, almost pleading tone, he wasn't trying to dominate the listener. He was trying to connect, to make them feel the weight of what he was describing. The two men didn't become close friends after that day. They respected each other, acknowledged each other at industry events, but they stayed in their separate lanes. Brown remained the godfather, the architect of funk, the man who turned performance into spectacle. Marvin remained the prince, the poet, the man who turned soul music into something introspective and haunted. But the exchange in that studio mattered because it clarified something essential about soul music in the 1970s. There wasn't one way to be a black male artist. There wasn't one correct approach to masculinity, to performance, to expression. Brown's way was valid. Marvin's way was valid. And the tension between them, rather than being destructive, was generative. It pushed both of them to be more fully themselves. Years later, after Marvin's death in 1984, James Brown was asked about him in an interview. The interviewer mentioned the studio encounter, expecting Brown to laugh it off or dismiss it as ancient history. But Brown's response was serious. "Marvin sang different than me," Brown said, "but he sang true. That's all that matters. You sing true to who you are, or you're just making noise." It was a eulogy disguised as a philosophy, and it said more about both men than any of their records ever could. The story of that exchange, Marvin, you sing like a woman, and Marvin's instant response spread through the music industry like wildfire. It became one of those moments that people told and retold, that got exaggerated and distorted over time. Some versions claimed they almost came to blows. Others said Brown stormed out. But the people who were actually there, the engineers who witnessed it, always told the same version. Two men, two philosophies, one moment of honesty. What made Marvin's response so effective wasn't that it was cruel, it was that it was accurate. Brown did dance in ways that defied simple categorization. His movements were sensual, theatrical, expressive in ways that went beyond typical masculine performance. And by pointing that out, Marvin wasn't attacking Brown. He was saying, we're both doing something that doesn't fit the box they want to put us in, so why are you criticizing me for it? The exchange also revealed something about how both men thought about their audiences. Brown performed for crowds. His music was designed to fill arenas, to get thousands of people moving in unison, to create a collective physical experience. Marvin performed for individuals. Even when he was on stage in front of thousands, he sang like he was in a room with one person, making eye contact, telling them something private. Neither approach was better. They were just different. Brown's music made you want to move. Marvin's music made you want to sit still and listen. Brown's music was about the body. Marvin's music was about the mind and the heart, and both were essential to what soul music became. In the years that followed, Marvin never hardened his voice, never tried to sound more like what people expected a male soul singer to sound like. If anything, he went further in the opposite direction. Let's Get It On, released in 1973, was built entirely on intimacy, on the kind of sensuality that only worked because Marvin's voice was soft and inviting rather than aggressive. Sexual Healing, recorded in 1982, used that same vulnerability to create one of the most successful records of his career. Brown, meanwhile, never stopped pushing his vision of soul as power. He influenced generations of artists who came after him, from Prince to Michael Jackson, showing them that performance could be spectacle, that masculinity in music didn't have to be static or predictable. But what's remarkable is that both men, despite their differences, were fighting the same battle. They were resisting the industry's attempts to flatten them into something marketable and safe. Brown did it through dominance. Marvin did it through vulnerability. And both strategies worked because they were authentic. The studio where the exchange happened is gone now. demolished years ago. Motown moved to Los Angeles, and the Detroit building became a museum. But the moment itself lives on, not because it was a conflict, but because it was a clarification. Two men, two truths, both of them right. Before Brown left the studio that day, he did something unexpected. He asked Marvin to sing something for him, anything, right there without the recording equipment running. Marvin hesitated, then sang a few bars of Mercy, Mercy Me, his voice filling the small control room with that haunting falsetto. Brown listened with his eyes closed, and when Marvin finished, he opened them and said simply, "That's what I can't do. Don't ever lose that." And in the end, that's what the story's really about. Not masculinity, not competition, not ego. It's about the freedom to be exactly who you are, even when someone as powerful as James Brown tells you you're doing it wrong. Marvin heard the criticism, understood it, and responded with the only thing that mattered, his own truth, delivered with the same quiet confidence he brought to every song he ever sang. James Brown walked into that studio expecting deference. What he got was a mirror, and in that mirror he saw someone just as committed to their vision as he was to his. The laughter that followed wasn't surrender, it was recognition. Two kings, two kingdoms, no territory disputed. "Marvin, you sing like a woman, and you dance like one." 5 words answered with 5 words. And in those 10 words, an entire philosophy of artistic freedom, of refusal to conform, of the right to define yourself on your own terms. That was the moment. That was the truth, and neither man ever forgot it.